Hi, I'm Roxy. What you're seeing here is a painting I created for a Path of Exile fan art contest, and I'm going to quickly take you through the creation process. The painting took between 9 and 10 hours, at least from when I started recording, after I'd probably spent an hour or two coming up with the composition and doing the rough sketch. Maybe an hour looking for reference of all the things I wanted to include, and another hour to come up with the composition that I felt would work. So I started filming after I was happy with the sketch. And what I'm doing here is I'm painting underneath the sketch, laying down a basic, I don't know what you call it, a value key maybe. Basically just planning the lighting. What part of the painting is going to be the darkest and what part will be catching the light. Underneath the value layer, I've underpainted a flat green canvas. I did this because I know the scene I want to create is set in a forest, so it makes sense that the overall hue will be green. Also, it saves a lot of time to paint on a mid-tone canvas. If you start your painting on a white canvas, you spend a lot of time covering up the white, and it can also mess with your value range starting so bright. I've also started to lay in some basic local colors. I'm still painting underneath the sketch, but the aim here is to create a harmonious color gamut. I don't need details at this point. I'm just making sure that the painting feels how I want it to feel in terms of color, and also making sure that the colors I choose adhere to that basic value range that I first laid in. You will notice a grayscale thumbnail at the bottom left corner. I like to keep that there while I paint to make sure that I stick to the value range, and also to make sure that the painting reads well as a thumbnail. In this online era of social media, a painting is rarely seen at full size in all its glory. And if it doesn't look good small, people will just scroll past and never get to appreciate your work. So it's got to look good small. Now that I have my basic palette established, I want to separate the ranger from the background. And the reason for this is so that I can freely paint behind her instead of having to paint around the figure. Now, I could have deep edged her or used a selection brush or something like that, but I find I get the best results by using a 100% opacity brush to paint a flat silhouette, because I feel I can judge the edge quality better this way than using a selection from the start. And once I have my silhouette, of course, I'm painting this on a separate layer. I can just control click on that layer to get my selection, and then I can switch to the layer that has the real colors on and just lift that to its own layer. After that, I don't need the red layer anymore. I'm not a person who uses a separate layer for every little thing. I just don't have the patience for that. But separating the focal point from everything else just makes life easier. Mostly, I just use new layers to paint out areas, and when I'm happy, I flatten them down. So it's a constant process of add new layer, paint on it a bit, flatten it down, and so the process starts again. That way, if I don't like what I've done, I can just delete the layer instead of spamming undo 100 times and then finding out I've run out of undo steps. You'll know what I'm talking about. It's not even that I undo a lot. In fact, I rarely go backward in a painting, but I just like the option of being able to go back in time. I think from a psychological point of view, it makes me feel more daring in the creation process, and confidence often pays off. So what I'm doing here is adding in some hints of forest in the background. Nothing at that level will contain any fine detail or any contrast. It's what we call atmospheric perspective. You fade out the contrast and details in the background in order to push the closeness of the foreground. Photographers would call that depth of field. In reality, you'd see a lot more detail and contrast on the other side of the river, unless it's very foggy. But by pushing that haze, we make sure that nothing back there competes with the focal point for attention. Now you see, as I'm working on that river, I can freely paint behind the ranger without having to carefully paint around her. Such is the beauty of a well-placed layer. You'll notice how the trees aren't on a separate layer, so I do have to paint around them instead of behind them, which isn't as efficient or natural feeling in terms of brush strokes. But I didn't want the trees on their own layer because it becomes overkill and too much micromanaging when everything's on its own layer. And I don't mind if my brush goes over a little into the trees and then I've got to fix them, because tree silhouettes aren't really complex to redo, unlike the ranger. So it's quick to fix. Already at this point, I've got too many layers for my liking, so I end up flattening a whole bunch of them. Here I've started to add some highlights to the bow. I'm still painting very roughly, just basically planning out the values on a smaller scale now. Thickening up that arrow shaft, I realize I made it hairline thin in the sketch. Here I'm carrying on with the highlights, figuring out where the sun will be hitting her from above and lightening those planes. If you're curious about the painting program, this is Corel Painter, version 2023. It's got a very powerful brush engine. All the brushes I'm using are custom brushes that I made myself, and you can find most of them on my Gumroad for free. Or for a couple of dollars, link in description. Lately, I've been making my own foliage and grass brushes, some of which I used in this painting. Those aren't on Gumroad yet because I'm still testing and refining them. So as I was saying, Corel Painter is a great program, and I'm not just saying that because I'm an affiliate. I've been using it since version 2019 and it just keeps getting better. It's not cheap. But at least it's a once-off cost, not like Photoshop where you have to rent it for the rest of your life. Also, if you use my affiliate link in description, you can get around $100 off, so that's certainly worth it. Besides Corel Painter, I'm using a Huion Inspiroy 1060p graphics tablet. I'm not a Huion affiliate, but I'd also highly recommend them. I used to use the small Wacom Intuos, but I prefer my Huion. Not only is it bigger and significantly cheaper, but it has more pressure sensitivity and the nibs don't wear down as fast. If you're on the fence about buying a graphics tablet, let me just say I wasted many years using a mouse because I thought if I was going to get a graphics tablet, I needed to have a screen, and they're just too expensive for me. But I was wrong. You really don't need a screen. The magic of a tablet is the pressure sensitivity that the stylus has. A mouse doesn't have pressure sensitivity. You can't softly click your mouse button. It's full click or nothing. But with a stylus, you can vary the opacity within your stroke by how much pressure you apply. That's where the magic is, not the screen. I put off buying a tablet for so long because screen tablets were so expensive, and I thought that's what I needed. And I thought it would be easier to paint because you can look down at the screen and see exactly where you're painting, like in real life. But in reality, with a screenless tablet, you can always see your cursor on the screen, so you know where the brush tip is at all times. And, I thought there would be a disconnect between what your hand is doing and what you're seeing on screen, but there really isn't. It's also more comfortable because you've got a nice big monitor screen and you can sit up straight with good posture. Whereas on a screen tablet, unless you have some fancy ergonomic setup, it's quite hard on the neck. And if you're in your 20s, you might not feel it, but at 40-something, trust me, you're going to regret hunching over a screen tablet. I did buy myself a second-hand iPad with Apple Pencil just so I could try screen painting, and that's how I know posture is a thing. Now, if I draw on my iPad, I do it leaning back in bed with loads of pillows to keep my spine straight. I must say, though, Procreate is such a quality app. I wish there was a Windows version of it. So what I'm doing is darting around the painting, adding slightly more detail all around. I like to, as far as possible, gradually progress the whole painting rather than fixating on one spot, finishing it and moving on. If you paint like that, you leave yourself very little room for big changes when they're necessary. You know, if you're halfway through a painting and you want to change the position or size of something, you might become less inclined to make that fix if you spend time on micro details that might get spoiled in the process. However, if you gradually work up the whole piece, you can see problems as they arise and it's less scary to fix them. You'll see me trying out some of my custom foliage brushes here. I hope to put a brush pack together soonish, but I still have a lot of testing to do. I don't like selling brush packs unless I'm confident that every brush in the pack is useful in a real-world application. Here I've decided to add another branch. It's never too late to add things in a painting. As long as you're happy with the basic composition, you can always start and then add more supporting detail as you go along. As they were before, I liked the thickness and position of the foreground trees, but they were looking a bit samey. I mean, to a point they need to be. They're all mostly the same type of tree, but they should at least have their own character. Starting to shape up the rocks in the foreground. I don't spend too long on this, just trying to give it a bit of angularity so that it doesn't look like a pile of marshmallow. I wanted to brighten up the sky in the background a bit, so what I'm doing here is I made a copy of the background painting layer and I set the layer to screen, which creates a brighter version of it. I then just erase out the parts that I want to stay dark. I could have done this with a mask as well. In fact, later on in the painting you'll see me do it that way, but here I just used the eraser to remove parts of the screen layer that I didn't want, and then flatten the layer down to the canvas level again. And then I create a new layer on top of the sketch layer so I can start properly painting, sharpening up the contours with some subtle line work and designing some of the shapes a little better. I start out with the sketch layer hidden, but then I turn it back on later and carry on. I start laying in the foundation of bark, but also angling the strokes to support the perspective. The horizontal bark lines below eye level are mostly curved downwards, and the strokes that I make above eye level are mostly curved upwards. This helps accentuate that 3D form and the perspective. Also deleting some line work from the sketch layer in places that's no longer needed. I'm working a little bit on the spider corpse and the other creature. I'm adding quite strong highlights because the monsters you kill via the Crucible League mechanic in the game have a distinct chrome look to them. At this point I realize that I actually want to reposition the angle of the spider to the ground, but Corel Painter doesn't currently have a warp tool. I do know they're looking into it, but at the moment they don't have one, so I've opened the file in PaintStorm Studio to do this instead. If you haven't used a warp tool, it's really useful. It just creates a mesh and then you can push and pull points of the mesh, which in turn manipulates different parts of the painting. PaintStorm Studio is another exceptional paint program, and for a once-off $20 you really can't go wrong. It's also got a great brush engine, not as diverse as Corel Painter's, but certainly more powerful than Photoshop's. Back in Corel Painter, I just cover up the background that's been revealed because of the warping. And then I continue to dart around, adding detail in various places and sharpening up areas. At this point, I decide I want a subtle dark vignette on the sides of the painting to draw attention to the brighter area where the ranger is. So I duplicate the background layer and set it to multiply. This creates a darker version of the scene. It's too dark though, so I drop the layer opacity a little, and then I use the eraser around the focal point and a few other areas where I want the brighter version to shine through. I then collapse it down and start adding a bit of subtle interest to the far bank. I'm painting the impression of a fallen over tree trunk and working a little bit more on the river reflections. I'm still glad that I have the ranger on her own layer. As you can see, it does make life easier. The rocks are looking like the weakest point at this stage of the painting, so I start shaping them up. I'm not using any reference, so really just experimenting with shapes till I see something that pleases me. I have a tutorial on painting rocks if you're interested, link in description. I think it's pretty useful if I do say so myself. In my mind though, these aren't natural rocks, more like something like a collapsed ruin from some temple or something like that, which is why I'm squaring most of the pieces off. Bringing back the foliage layer I hid earlier, this was one of the custom brushes I made. I see it just as something to work with, but I'm going in there and painting over them, defining each frond. This is foreground foliage, so I want to spend some time here not just giving the impression of foliage, but actually painting it purposefully and sharply. I then got sidetracked doing some extra branches for a bit before going back to the foreground foliage. I'm darkening the leaves where I think they're turned away from the sun and brightening up the tips that are facing upward. I also remove some of the leaves for a less uniform look. So that's how I use custom foliage brushes. I lay down an idea, something to start with, some visual noise that gets me thinking about the right kind of shapes. But I don't feel beholden to paint over exactly how they were. If I think a different shape works better, I do it that way. And I'm going nice and dark on these leaves. I still sometimes hear my late high school art teacher shouting, "Big, black and bold." That was her way of reminding us not to be timid with our line work, to be intentional with our mark making. And what better place for that than the absolute foreground of the image where we need things to be visually sharpest. For the tree on the left here, I want to insinuate that there's a thick vine creeper growing up the side, and some of the younger sprigs are spilling out over the rocks. I end up coming back to that later. For now, I want to focus on giving our star of the show the detail she deserves. So I start by lowering the opacity of the sketch layer and start on a new layer on top where I can do some neater, more subtle line work and paint within that. It's a basic back and forth process of subtly outlining and filling in the outlines with more precise paintwork, and then deleting the initial sketch layer as I go along. While I'm working on the bow, let me just tell you a bit about the contest. The goal is for us to showcase something from the new Crucible League. So you could, for example, paint a battle scene when you initiate the Crucible mechanic, or you could paint a Crucible passive skill tree, or what I chose to do, you could paint something that showcases some of the new gear. And I had a look through what was added, and I really liked the design of the Widowhail bow, a new unique bow. Well done to the concept designer. It's very unique looking, which is good because it's a unique item. So I started imagining the ranger character, this lady, and I thought the bow would be best as a focal point if I had her facing it towards the sky. It makes sense in the context of the game because there's a skill called Rain of Arrows where the character shoots upward, and while it rains arrows. Even not in the context of the game, I could make it work if I put her in a forest scene and then it seems like she's shooting things out of the trees. And there are a few forests in the game, so that's how the whole scene came together in my imagination. Then all I had to do was grab some reference and start sketching layouts. Just correcting the shape of the upper arm. I feel like it's jutting out a little unnaturally. Giving the arrow shaft a bit of form, and then working my way down the hand and arm. I was quite lucky to find some nice pose reference. There's this website called Figurosity. I'll put a link in the description. It has a huge database of 3D modeled action poses. It also has a great filtering system, which I used to narrow down the results to ones where a bow was involved. And I found two poses that I liked, one with the upper body at the angle that I wanted, and one with the lower body at the angle I wanted. So I just screenshotted both and then based my sketch on a hybrid of the two poses. As I'm working on the character, I realize the shaft of the bow is actually a bit long for the length of the quiver. It's partly because there's no feather on the end yet, but I just wanted to shorten it a tad from the top first, and then I start drawing the feather. Even with the feather, the arrow is still too long, so I decide to lengthen the quiver. Now the quiver's not really from the game. I took the basic shape of the signal fire quiver, and then I just winged it, so it's my own design. Working on the bowstring now. That definitely needs to be on its own layer. I learned that the hard way in a previous painting that I also, it also had an archer character in it. And trust me, you don't want to have to be painting around the strings and then accidentally painting over it and trying to get the exact angle of the string to fix it. It's just a pain in the ass. So yes, new layer for that. When it came to the ranger's face, I had some reference from the game. So while I was drawing her, I was looking at these two screenshots and trying to draw what I thought she'd look like from this angle. It's actually quite difficult to do that. I take my hat off to people who draw the same character in a variety of poses, like for example comic book artists and book illustrators, trying to get that same face in different angles. Here I'm shading up the quiver, going for a hard leather with metal clasps on the end. So the clothes are loosely based on her default gear that you see in game here. Obviously I don't have a reference of how they'd look exactly from this angle, so I'm having to imagine how the clothes would react in this scenario. For example, because she has her arm raised, that breast will become a point of tension, so the shirt folds will all converge to that point. So just a bit about the game. If you've never played Path of Exile, it's an RPG, role-playing game, similar to the Diablo franchise, but a lot more involved. My first experience with an RPG was Diablo 2. I love that game, played it for years. A man recently bought me Diablo 2 Resurrected, which is the remake of it, and it's still good. Better than most of the copycats like Titan Quest, Torchlight, Grim Dawn, Victor Vran. But Path of Exile is better than all of them, including Diablo 2 and 3. And recently, having played the beta of Diablo 4, I still think Path of Exile is better. Of course, that's my subjective opinion. Nothing wrong with disagreeing. If you're into RPGs, let me know in the comments what you think. Spent some time trying to get the other eye looking right. At this face angle, getting the other eye to not look crazy is more difficult than it seems. Once I zoomed in, I realized there was something very wrong with her nose. So I had to spend a bit of time playing around and figuring out how to shape it so that it didn't look crazy. If I recall, I also had some reference of a head at a similar angle on my other monitor to help. And then just introduced a little bit of pink to her lips as well. So there's a few different characters in Path of Exile besides the ranger. We've got the witch, typically a ranged character like the ranger. She's pretty fun. You can build her up as an elementalist, shooting fire, ice or lightning, or you can turn her into a necromancer where your minions fight for you. We've got the duelist, typically close range fighting with swords. The marauder is also close range, but strong, where the duelist is fast. The Templar looks like an old man in a dress, but you can either go ranged or melee, depending on how you build him. The Shadow is like your typical rogue type character. You'll be fighting with daggers and claws or traps, which is more fun than it sounds. You could also unlock the Scion character. She starts in the middle of the passive skill tree, so she's good for unusual builds. So those are our characters, and as for the game itself, Path of Exile is a massive game. It's got 10 acts, and then after you complete those, you've got over 150 new maps in the Atlas content. Not to mention Path of Exile 2 is coming soon as well, which will add a whole new campaign. Looking forward to that. The boots are loosely based on this design that I found online. I designed them to be a bit more suited to the fantasy genre by adding that winklepecker tip to the points of the shoes. Emphasizing the contact shadows here, and then flitting about, adding some details here and there. At this point, I spent a bit of time trying to make the ground cover more believable. Sometimes I'm using my custom foliage and grass brushes, sometimes not. I decided it would make sense to add more evidence of spider infestation in the scene, so I painted some cocoons on the far side of the bank. Nothing in your face, just something you might notice if you look long enough. And then also some webbing in the foreground, also custom brushes. I believe this was from my particle brush set. Then I got serious about texturing the trees to make them look rough and barky. Or at least this tree. I did the other trees later. Here I was working a bit on the background behind the ranger to make sure that she stands out nicely even at thumbnail size. I wanted to add a magic effect to the bow, so I used my custom brush called Magic Flame. It's part of my particle brush set. Here I'm thickening up this branch. I was thinking it seemed a bit thin for something directly attached to such a thick trunk. I then start barking up this tree. That sounds a bit ambiguous, but you know what I mean. After a good deal of time spent barking up the trees, I wanted to add some fungus and moss. So I start with some mushroom type growths, colored them red, added some shadows under them to accentuate the fact that they're sticking out of the trees. I then started on some green moss, started by using one of my custom foliage brushes, and then switched to one of my regular brushes to shape it up. Over on the other side, I crack out one of my other custom foliage brushes to make those vines look a little more lush. Then I grab a regular brush to just vary the values, because not every leaf is going to be catching full light. I also remove some of it so that it's not too eye-catching. I just want to create areas to look at after you've seen the initial focal point, but I don't want them competing with the ranger's bow for attention. Just chiseling out these foreground leaves a little. Slipping in my signature there because I think I'm almost done. Turns out I wasn't though. At this point I want to add some cast shadows from the ranger, but rather than painting them in, I decide to duplicate the background layer, set it to multiply, create a mask, fill in the mask with black, and then I can paint with white on the mask layer to reveal the shadows. Once I'm happy with that, I collapse it down and do the same with the ranger layer so I can paint some cast shadows there too. I then collapse that down and duplicate the layer again. This time I want to paint in highlights, so I set the layer to screen, which creates a lighter version of it. And again, I make a mask, fill it with black, and this time when I paint white on it, I'll be revealing the sunspots and highlights. I do end up changing the layer from screen to color dodge, as I feel that makes a better effect. The aim is to create a bit of a dappled effect, like sun is leaking through the trees. Once I'm happy with that, I collapse it down and do a little non-mask normal painting on top. After I was satisfied with the dappled light in the background, I also want to add some highlights to the ranger herself, so I did the same process with the mask. I then collapse it down and do a bit of normal painting on top, and adding a warmer green on top of the leaves to make them feel like they're catching the sun. Now, I thought I was finished with the painting, but lying in bed, I got this brilliant idea that I needed to make the arrow head white so it looks like it's catching the sun. So went back and started making that happen. I'm almost done now, but I wasn't entirely happy with the magic effect on the bow. Fortunately, this is still on its own layer, which makes manipulating it much easier. A bit happier with the magic effect. I decided to add some purple bounce light to a few spots. It only makes sense. Here I grabbed some yellow and swiped it across a few areas to indicate sun warmth. Touched up the webbing. Just shaping the background here. Darkening up the shadow side of the face. And ending off with more barking up the trees and random detailing. So I have to say I was very pleased to see the rules said no AI art. I wouldn't have bothered entering if they'd allowed AI art because my piece would have just gotten lost in a sea of no effort generated pieces. Even with the explicit no AI in the rules, I see some contestants have still tried their luck. They've been caught out, but I won't be surprised if at least some generated art doesn't manage to slip in unawares. It's at the point now where genuine artists have to make videos like this, or at least document their process to prove that they aren't using AI. It's sad that artists now have this extra added burden instead of just being able to spend more time painting, but such is life. Lucky for me, I was going to film it anyway for my patrons. Talking of which, just want to say, well, not only thanks to my patrons, obviously thank you to them, appreciate them immensely, but thank you for watching. Much obliged if you leave a like and subscribe, and even more obliged if you share this video so that I have a better chance of breaking through the AI fart miasma. Until the next one, God bless.